Stagecoach by Shaun J. Nigro. Narrated by Todd Waites. The desert sun did not wane for Wyatt as he pushed through the last leg of his journey. He had pulled the reins on his old horse, Curly, on account of the heat, which had driven Wyatt to drink most of the water in his canteen. He had seen Curly push through some unrelenting days in the desert, but the gelding, gray as the unswept dust in a forgotten saloon, was showing his age lately. Probably, this would be Curly's last long trip. Wyatt focused on the familiar blotches of cacti ahead, deciding that now wasn't the time to be thinking about death. The only thing standing between Wyatt and the demons of the desert was Curly. He was sure that, should Curly decide to kick the bucket, he would not last more than a day on the unforgiving terrain, though he would sure as hell put up a fight. He gave his old friend a loving pat on the neck, but dug his heels into his side, thinking a little more speed might not hurt. Even in the afternoon sun, this part of the desert gave Wyatt the chills. He was grateful for his years of experience in being able to identify exactly where he was on the path, which was only even visible at this point to a trained eye, but he had heard too many strange things about the area to ever feel comfortable. Over many bubbling pints, Wyatt had eavesdropped on barstool patrons babbling about ghosts and demon creatures prowling the area. Some even swore they had seen such things looking back at them from the outskirts of the nearest town, Rochester, Wyatt's final destination on this journey. Wyatt had never actually seen such things, but he occasionally got the feeling he was being watched, especially when he had to stop for Curly at one of 3 reliable watering holes. The last of those holes awaited them, just beyond the cacti ahead. "You thirsty, boy?" Curly raised his head in response with a snort. "I don't blame you." He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow and scanned the hostile horizon. "Could use a drink myself." Wyatt pulled the snakeskin-covered canteen from his satchel and tried to shake out a drop, but knew the gesture was futile. As he reached around to put the canteen away, he was startled by a loud neighing and nearly thrown from Curly's back. "Whoa, now!" He grabbed the reins tight and tried to calm the horse down. "It's okay, buddy." Curly stopped neighing, but could not stand still, pacing from side to side nervously. "What's the matter, Curly?" He scanned the horizon again, this time with a hand on his holster. Demons and ghosts aside, there were plenty of things to be worried about in open country. He was fairly certain the Indians would not bother him, as they too tended to avoid this part of the path, but there was always a bounty out on some big bomb Billy wannabe outlaw. He could take on 1, maybe even 2 misguided scoundrels, but a gang would be another story. Only once had he been truly outnumbered, and he escaped then by the skin of his neck. Literally, he could feel the sun beating down on the scar that the bullet had left behind. Curly neighed and jolted again, this time throwing Wyatt from the saddle and causing him to roll backward over the hard ground. "For Pete's sake, Curly!" Before he could get a grip on the saddle to hop back on, the horse ran frightened in the direction they had come from. "Dagnabbit!" he shouted, and was surprised to see Curly stop and turn around to face him from a distance. "What in the hell is going on with you?" The horse snorted and pounded its front legs into the ground. "We ain't got time for games. I got a package needs delivering." Wyatt was referring to the mysterious cloth-wrapped ball he had received upon his arrival in the next closest town to Rochester, Dalesworth. He was, for lack of a better word, the mailman, though his deliveries tended to be for characters adjacent to the law. He wasn't proud of it, but he told himself that he could hardly be blamed if he never knew what the packages contained. "Get back here!" He tried, but Curly snorted again. An odd thing happened then. Odd because, despite the heat, Wyatt's body suddenly convulsed with a chill that straightened the black hairs on the back of his neck. He had that feeling again, like he was being watched. And then he heard something. The sound was faint, but seemed to be coming from behind him. Faster than a saloon bean fart, Wyatt pulled the revolver from his holster and spun around on his heels, firing one bullet straight ahead. But there was no one there. He held the gun tight and moved his eyes from side to side. Then he heard the sound again and looked down to find a large tarantula crawling up his boot. Without hesitating, he kicked the spider onto its back and dug his heel into its body, forcing a small gush of guts to splay out onto the dry earth bed. "Just a spider, Curly," Wyatt shouted. He guessed the horse had been startled by the creature. Not that he could blame him. Something about a living thing having too many legs gave him the creeps. The only thing worse, maybe, was a creature with no legs at all, which he had been fortunate enough to have not witnessed on this journey. "Come on, buddy." Wyatt started to turn around, but raised the revolver again when he saw a man standing next to his horse. The man, wearing a pair of dusty tinted spectacles, stood perfectly erect, smiling. "Mister, you got about 2 seconds to step away from my horse." The man waited a moment before responding. "I am not interested in your horse." "Then you better tell me what it is you are interested in." Wyatt let his index finger hug the trigger a little tighter. "I wondered if you could assist me." "Strangers don't often go asking for help around these parts." "And I would not wish to bother you on any other occasion, but I find myself in a bit of a sore spot." Wyatt thought the man was a bit of a sore spot himself. "I got a stagecoach run off the trail not far from here." The man pointed. "Please, sir, my family is waiting." It was not common, but there was a path that cut through the route from Rochester to Dalesworth, typically used by foreigners making their way up north. Wyatt had once planned to take that path himself someday, but life had given him other plans. "You picked a hell of a place to break down. This area ain't for picnicking." "Oh, I am aware," the man said, still smiling. Something in the way he said it made Wyatt uncomfortable. "How far from here is your stagecoach?" "Just beyond the cacti," the man pointed again. Wyatt considered the scenario. He had only a few hours of sunlight left, and he at least wanted to get Curly to the last watering hole. There was no real deadline on the delivery, but he had carved out a nice little reputation for himself on account of his speedy journeys. Then again, he also liked to think he still had some semblance of a heart. It was too easy to go bad in these parts, so he held on to this virtue like a badge, especially after he'd seen what the desert life did to his father. "I'll follow you. You just stay ahead, and I'll do what I can. But if it's bad, Curly can't tow more than 1 or 2 people, if that. You'd have to send someone back." "Thank you kindly." Wyatt found himself wondering what the man's eyes looked like. All he could see in the dusty glass of the spectacles was the reflection of the desert landscape. It was as if the man had sprouted from the ground where he stood. "And what is your name?" he said, approaching Curly, who still seemed nervous but had calmed down considerably. The man paused. "You can call me Adam." "I'll call you Adam, then." Wyatt pulled himself up onto Curly's back, suspicious of the biblical name. "Lead the way, Adam." He kept his distance as Adam walked ahead of him. With time now to focus, he could properly size up the strange man. He was dressed all in black, from his waistcoat to cotton trousers that seemed too baggy for a man of his size. Now that he observed him closer, he realized none of this attire quite fit. It made him look awkward, like he was trying hard to play human. For the first time, he also noticed that the man had no shoes on his feet. His suspicion of the situation began to grow. "What happened to your shoes?" The man stopped and looked down at his feet, as if he had forgotten he wasn't wearing any. "Oh, I guess I must have left them behind. I'd been asleep when the stagecoach broke down. My wife, she was manning the reins, and I sort of panicked." "Good way to invite snake venom into your veins." The man laughed uncomfortably. "I will be sure to grab them when we reach the stagecoach." "Probably best you did. I ain't got time to tend to no snake wounds." They walked on into the desert as the minutes dragged, and Wyatt could feel Curly growing restless. The sun had descended further toward the horizon, and Wyatt was on the verge of calling the whole thing off before the man finally stopped. As he approached, he saw the man staring down into a rocky gorge. At the bottom of the gorge, he could see a stagecoach, no doubt decimated by the impact of a fall. "Sir, you said you went off path. You didn't say you rode off a cliff." "Please, can you help me? My family is down there." Wyatt wondered how anyone, let alone the man, could have survived such a fall. Even from these heights, he could see that the stagecoach was nearly flattened. Precious cargo was sprawled about, clearly evacuated on impact from the violent tumult. "I don't see any signs of life down there. How did you manage to climb up here anyhow? You must have been hurt bad, especially if you were sleeping like you say." As Wyatt pulled the reins to guide Curly away from the cliff's edge, he heard a skittering sound. Curly must have seen the source of the sound first, because Wyatt was suddenly swiftly catapulted from the gelding's back. Curly whinnied as Wyatt found himself falling for longer than he had anticipated. He guessed, too late, that he had been thrown from the cliff's ledge. When he finally hit the ground, his world went dark. The first thing Wyatt heard before his vision returned was the comforting sound of a crackling fire. Once heard, he quickly attributed the sound to the warmth he could feel pressing against the front side of his body. Against the backdrop of the fire, he swore he heard something else, something succulent. He forced his eyes open, as if he had been trying desperately to wake himself from a nightmare. The world was sideways. It took him another moment to realize he was laying on the ground, face firm against the desert dirt, as if he had been thrown there. Ahead of him was a small fire. Beyond the fire, through undulating wisps of hot flame, was the man with the spectacles, feasting heartily on the tender meat of some unrecognizable beast. Wyatt attempted to move his arms to right himself, but he discovered he had been bound tight. He wriggled once more, but succeeded only in garnering the spectacled man's attention. The man stopped chewing his meat and looked ahead at Wyatt, remaining perfectly still. The reflection of the fire in his dark-tinted spectacles, along with his ominously silhouetted figure against the starry night sky, gave the man a sinister demeanor. Wyatt's gut dropped with a realization of what the man may have been eating. "Where's my horse?" Wyatt said sternly. The man smiled and continued eating. Wyatt started to say something, but stopped when he heard Curly's familiar whine. He lifted his head as much as he could to face the direction of the whine, cracking his neck in the process. Not far from the fire, by scattered fragments of the decimated stagecoach, he could see Curly had been tied to the decayed stump of an old desert willow. He looked unharmed, but stomped where he stood with irritable impatience. Wyatt started to wriggle again, this time toward Curly. The man did not move, but continued to eat. He came into clearer view as he rounded the fire pit, and Wyatt stopped in sudden horror at the sight of what the spectacled man had truly been feasting on. It was not the limb of a beast, but the lower part of a child's leg, charred, no doubt, from the heat of the angry flames. Wyatt dry heaved, his body attempting to dispense with sustenance he had not afforded himself since they set out from Dalesworth. The man continued to eat as he stared on in horror, but his attention was thwarted again by the movement out of the corner of his eye. Somewhere between the distance that stretched between him and Curly, a large tarantula scurried. It was moving in the direction of the debris of the stagecoach. Curly seemed to notice it too, as his stomping became more violent. Wyatt looked cautiously back at the spectacled man, but he did not seem perturbed. He continued to wriggle toward Curly, keeping one eye on the man. He was halfway to Curly when a loud pop suddenly gave way to a crackling cacophony of splintering wood. The stagecoach sank further into the ground, kicking up a cloud of desert dust. Wyatt noticed two things of importance then, one more enticing than the other. A true case of good news, bad news. On the one hand, a shiny silver revolver rolled out from behind a shred of the canvas covering what remained of the stagecoach. On the other hand, the collapse had evidently disturbed a nest of tarantulas as big, or bigger, than the one that had scurried between him and Curly. Wyatt looked on in horror as an army of arachnids scurried out in all directions from beneath the wreckage. Curly stomped violently, forcing the willow stump to loosen in the earth bed like a stubborn baby tooth. Wyatt closed his eyes as the spider scurried over his body. He felt 8 legs feel their way over his face, pausing for a moment before continuing on. When he opened his eyes again, he saw that the man was no longer seated by the fire. He rolled onto his back, wincing in agony at what must have been bruised and/or broken bone, probably from the fall. He could not see the man anywhere near the fire. He looked back to Curly, who had settled down a little and was now staring back at him, almost pleading. "We got ourselves in a pretty pickle, buddy." Curly lifted his muzzle slightly as if in agreement. Wyatt rolled back onto his side, feeling the throbbing pain once more. The revolver lay untouched on the cold desert ground. He wriggled toward the gun as fast as he could, trying his best to ignore the pain in his back. When he finally reached the gun, he rolled to position his backside toward it and stretched his fingers as best as he could from his still bound hands. When he felt his fingertips brush against the metal, he wriggled his body back and reeled the gun into the tightest grip he could manage. He froze as a grotesque, splitting sound came from behind him. He thought at first the stagecoach was going to collapse even further, but the splitting continued alongside a horrendous screeching sound that echoed into the night. Curly was pacing nervously, pulling harder at the old stump. Wyatt wondered how much more resistance the stump had in it. When he heard something approaching from behind him, he did not hesitate to pull the trigger on the revolver. The sound startled Curly, causing him to pull at the stump even harder until, finally, the wood gave way. The gelding ran toward Wyatt, and for a moment he thought the beast was going to trample him. But at the last second, Curly leapt over him in the direction of the screeching. Wyatt rolled over to find the spectacled man, or what now merely resembled him, knocked onto his back. Curly turned to face them, seeming proud of what he had done. But Wyatt could see that the man was no longer much of a man at all. 8 large, bristling, black appendages had emerged from the man's torso. They were the legs of a spider. "Jumped up Mary," Wyatt said in shock. Evidently, Curly had done enough damage on impact to render the creature momentarily confused. Wyatt watched as he wriggled like a tarantula turned onto its back. His new appendages thrashed about as he screeched, either in pain or in anger. Wyatt did not wish to find out. He released his grip on the revolver and pushed through the pain, screaming as he managed to bring himself to his feet. He stumbled around the man, who, he noticed, still wore those tinted spectacles. Curly calmed down as Wyatt approached and let his head fall on the gelding's shaggy mane. He saw that the satchel with the package was still hanging from Curly's saddle. "Go on, pal. You got a package to deliver." Curly whinnied. "I ain't gonna make it." The horse stomped its feet in protest. "You know the way. You know the desert as well as I do." Wyatt felt a piercing sensation in his back, worse than the broken bones. Something sharp was forcing its way through him, slow enough that he could feel every inch of its progression. He had the thought of blackberries being mashed between fingertips, and he looked down to find his insides spilling out onto the desert floor. He looked back up into Curly's large black eyes. The horse nudged its head once more in understanding and backed away as Wyatt watched the ground fall away from his feet. He had been lifted into the air, and he could feel more appendages tightening around his torso. Curly gave one final vociferous neigh and took off into the cold desert night. Wyatt felt a warm breath on the back of his neck, where the bullet scar was. He had a strangely secure sensation as the appendages squeezed him tighter. His eyes remained open, his conscience somehow intact, as 2 large fangs dug deep into the back of his neck. He endured the night and watched the sun rise once more as the life was drawn at a snail's pace from his paralyzed body. And finally, he let the desert take him. The Man with the Sunglasses by Shaun J. Nigro. The man with the sunglasses stands straight, with his hands tucked in the pockets of his dusty trousers. He wears a khaki suit, the color of the desert sand he stands upon, with a faded red tie. Behind him is his chariot, an old black prison bus covered in a sprawling network of spider webs. The windshield is barely visible behind the webs, which reach up over the roof of the bus, where something sinister sits. It is either a spider with too many legs or a crude taxidermy experiment comprised of multiple arachnids. Either way, it is frighteningly large. The many legs of this abomination stretch out on either side of the bus, held together only by a large, human-like skull. It is the skull of a giant, long ago slain, perhaps by the man with the glasses himself, or perhaps the man simply likes the way it looks, adorning his only means of transportation. By day, across this barren desert landscape, like a Lovecraftian Jesus piece. By night, the man leaves his demented prison bus and park while he traverses the sands with means wholly his own. Sunsets, like the one the man admires now, are his favorite time of day. It is a time of anticipation. It is a prelude to ecstasy, to a feeding frenzy worth every monotonous sound in the slumber of the hive. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" Rome yelled to his brother, who had apparently already made up his mind. Darius had already disappeared into the old prison, leaving Rome alone in what was left of the prison yard. Rome kicked a small rock, sending it tumbling across the sand. Behind the prison, the sun was setting, casting an ominous shadow over him. They had come in through a hole in the barbed wire-topped fence that surrounded at least an acre of land around the complex. "Come on, Darius, it's going to be dark soon." He tried once more, but knew it was useless. Once Darius had an idea, he was unstoppable, usually until the consequences of his actions came inevitably crashing down on him. That, Rome figured, was probably the reason Darius had never been able to make much of himself outside of owning a rundown strip club in the middle of nowhere. The common sense in their family rested on Rome, if he could manage to keep up. A sound like a maraca caught Rome's attention. A few feet away, a rattlesnake slithered over a rusty tire hub. It didn't appear to notice him, but Rome wasn't interested in taking chances. He ran up to the prison entrance and squeezed his body through the large metal doors that had been left ajar. "Man, this place is gnarly!" Darius's voice echoed through the hall. He popped his head out of a room at the far end. Rome walked slowly through the hall, avoiding spots of what looked like blood-stained floor. A waitress at a diner a few miles out had told him of this place. She said there had been a violent prison riot in the 80s. Not one security guard survived, and the inmates had all vanished. "Just poof, into thin air," she said. Apparently, one of the inmates was her husband, expecting to be released a month after the riot occurred. Rome gulped, imagining what he would do if he stumbled upon a corpse. He imagined the eyes of the waitress's husband looking up at him in horror. But, of course, this could not happen if everyone had vanished. Not to mention, he thought, a corpse would be a skeleton by now. "Darius, there could be squatters, meth heads." Rome thought of the snake. "Rattlesnakes." Nothing was getting through to his brother. "I can't speak for the snakes, but I think I can handle methies. You forget where I work." Rome laughed nervously. He wondered if Darius was referring to the customers or the strippers. "Well, I saw a snake outside." "I think they'll go for the warmth, little bro. Not much sun in here." "There won't be much sun out there soon," Rome started, but stopped when he heard his brother shriek. "Darius!" He ran up the hall to the room Darius had disappeared into. "Are you okay?" Inside the room, Darius stood, laughing now. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Look at the size of that fucking thing!" Darius pointed to the other side of the room, where a large tarantula sat motionless on a cracked urinal. "You scared the shit out of me." Rome was not a fan of spiders, but he was relieved to find his brother hadn't been stabbed by a confused squatter. Although, he had to admit, the tarantula was unusually large. "Lighten up. I'm just having some fun. Weren't you even the slightest bit curious about that riot the lady mentioned? I mean, isn't that prime writing inspiration?" Darius was referring to the fact that Rome was supposed to be a writer. This entire trip had been a welcome home excursion for him, having graduated college with a bachelor's in English. The only job he could imagine with that degree now was as a teacher. But his dream had always been to write like his idols, Stephen King, Clive Barker, even Lovecraft, despite the stigma around him now. Problem was, Rome didn't have the adventurous curiosity that his brother had, so most of what he wrote about was based on what he found online. Sure, I guess, but I could imagine it just fine from the car. I also would like to live to write about it, if possible. Jesus! They both flinched as the spider woke up. Its legs seemed to stretch out with an almost human-like gesture before it scurried back into the urinal, disappearing down the drain. Darius looked at Rome. All right, let's get out of here. He punched Rome playfully on the shoulder. No, I think I'd like to stay, explore a bit more, Rome joked. They stepped back out into the hall, which had grown darker with the setting sun. As they made their way back through the hall, Rome thought he heard skittering overhead. He glanced at Darius, who didn't appear to have noticed. He looked like he might have already forgotten about the spider and was plotting his next preposterous move. But they both stopped when the metal doors at the entrance creaked slowly open, casting a low light across the floor, illuminating one of the bloodstains. What the fuck is that? Darius looked uncomfortable. Rome would have teased him about this had he not wanted to know the same thing. Someone's coming in, Rome whispered. Come on. Darius pulled Rome into an adjacent corridor lined on both sides with jail cells. Rome followed, but thought he noticed the shadow of a person appearing in the doorway. Impossibly, the figure seemed to have extra arms above and below where his arms should have been. Probably a trick of the light. Jesus, watch out! Darius lifted his leg high over a tarantula, similar to the one from the urinal. It skittered behind an overturned table. Who do you think it is? Rome asked, looking back to see if they were being followed. I don't know. Probably just a squatter, like he said. Thought you said you could handle them. I can. Darius straightened a little, attempting to appear confident. I just don't want to get into it right now. When they reached the other end of this hall, Rome helped Darius push a heavy door open. The rusty hinges creaked and echoed through the hall. Rome looked back again, but still could see no one. He couldn't see much of anything now, as the sun had finished its descent. And, despite the spiders, they pushed on deeper into the darkness. There were no windows in this part of the prison, but there was a sense of space that made Rome believe they were in the dining hall. He was certain of this when their footsteps echoed loudly throughout the room. Something like the sound of an engine hummed quietly outside, and lights overhead flickered on, revealing a dining hall that reminded Rome of the cafeteria at his school. Some of the tables appeared to have been collapsed by force, and there were more bloodstains in odd spaces around the room. Hungry? Darius laughed nervously. I could go for some greasy fries. Rome smiled, but did not laugh. His heart was racing now. They both looked at each other with fear in their eyes when they heard the footsteps in the hall outside the dining hall. The kitchen. Rome understood immediately and ran with Darius to a lunch bar, which appeared to still have tubs of moldy food. He fought the urge to throw up as they ducked behind the bar below one of the tubs. Some of the moldy food was splattered across the floor, and he nearly slipped on some of the mess. Darius put a finger over his mouth to shush him. The footsteps grew louder as the person, whoever it was, stepped into the dining hall. Rome thought he heard him sniffing. The footsteps sounded closer now. There was another long sniff, and then an exhale of air. And then, silence. After a minute, Darius looked at Rome, who shrugged. They were startled when they heard what sounded like fingers pattering on a tabletop. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, in quick succession. Soon, the pattering grew longer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Still rapidly, as if multiple secretaries were expressing their aggravation at being asked to phone their busy boss. Then the pattering became rapid bursts of up to 8 and 16 notes. Had multiple people come into the room? The pattering stopped. All they could hear was the sound of their breath, which they were trying hard to hold at low decibels. Then the crunching began. It sounded like sticks, or bones, breaking. The sound became amplified and multiplied with its echo throughout the room, so that it surrounded the brothers. Darius put his hands over his ears. Rome just listened, mesmerized. Soon the sound began to feel comforting to him, and he thought he could fall asleep to it before the room became silent again. Rome said something when the lights went out. They sat in the dark, feeling colder now with the desert heat dissipating. Rome thought about what Darius had said about snakes looking for warmth. He wondered which fate he would prefer: murdered by a mysterious squatter, bitten by a rattlesnake, or something jostled his hair. "Darius," he whispered, but he could feel Darius next to him, apparently frozen in fear. He could feel that his arm was next to his own. Something jostled his hair again, this time in multiple places. He felt a slight weight on his pant leg. "Darius!" Darius still did not answer. Something tickled his arm. The engine sounded again, and the lights flickered on. Adrenaline pumped through Rome's veins when the light revealed tarantulas crawling all over him. There was a warm weight upon his head as multiple furry appendages crept over his eyelids. He jumped up, brushing the creatures off his body, and backed into a wall behind the bar. He saw now why Darius hadn't answered. A thick white silk completely covered his brother, revealing only his terrified eyes. Rome looked over the lunch bar at who had been following them, or what. In the middle of the dining hall, at a table that had not collapsed, sat a man with sunglasses. The man sat perfectly straight and seemed to stare ahead, away from Rome. Out of his back poked black, spindly arms, and Rome knew now how the pattering had been possible. The man turned his head toward Rome suddenly and smiled. Rome screamed and ran back to the door they came in through. The man did not move. He ran through the hall, stepping over more tarantulas that seemed now to be pouring down the walls and out of the jail cells. He did not know if the man was following him, but he did not want to look back. He tripped over the overturned table where the spider from before had gone, feeling thousands of legs grasping at his hands as he caught himself on the floor. He brushed them away again and turned into the main hall, seeing moonlight peeking through where the entrance to the prison had been left open. If he could make it to the car, he would be safe. He could go for help. But where? They were miles from anything. The last sign of human life that they had seen, besides the prison, was the diner. Then that would be where he would drive. But who would believe him? Rome's mind raced as he fell onto the sand outside the prison. He could see Darius's car just beyond the fence. Focus, Rome. He stood up and started running as fast as he could. Behind him, he heard skittering, but he refused to look back. He was nearly out of breath when he got to the car, and his heart sank in his chest when he realized the mistake he had made. The door was unlocked, but Darius had been the one driving. Darius had the keys. Fuck me. Rome got into the car, slamming the door shut behind him and pressing the lock button. He forced himself to look back at the prison. All he could see was the abandoned complex, looking even creepier in the moonlight. Why the fuck had he followed Darius inside? This was supposed to be a fun trip, a celebration for his achievements, and, he thought, a good luck to the rest of his life. Truthfully, he had been terrified to enter the real world. He did not want to end up like his brother. He did not want to spend the rest of his life waiting tables like the woman at the diner. He just wanted to write. Well, now he had something to write about. He started laughing. Quickly, his laughter became almost maniacal. He didn't know if he was dehydrated or just losing his mind. Maybe this had all been a dream, a product of a mind that was destined for delusions, just like their mother's. Yes, that was it. They hadn't mentioned her on the trip, but it was the thing that had been creeping in the back of both of their minds all along. Mom was gone. Mom was gone before she had taken her own life. And, deep down, Rome knew that what he was most afraid of was becoming like her, losing his grip on reality itself. Rome found his thoughts cut off abruptly by a large thud on the top of the car. He sat perfectly still, seeing nothing around the car or by the prison. The air was dead silent. Suddenly, 4 black legs came crashing through the windshield, lunging toward Rome's face. Rome woke up in the dark. He could feel that he was sitting in a corner, his back against a cold wall. The cold was made worse by the peculiar fact that his shirt was no longer on him. None of his clothes were on him anymore. He sat somewhere completely naked, surrounded by the darkness, trying to remember what had happened. But his memory seemed to cut off at the precise moment the windshield came raining down on him. "Darius," he tried. His voice felt small. There was no echo like there had been in the dining hall. He guessed now he was in a small room. Something rustled close to him. "Darius, is that you?" Rome realized then that there was a powerful scent coming from somewhere in the room. He sniffed, finding he was enjoying this scent. It made his stomach growl, and he realized he had not eaten since the diner, which was hours ago, maybe longer now. There was a rustling again. Rome felt a pain in his back. He sat up straighter, attempting to stretch. "Darius, where are we?" The pain began to feel unbearable, like something was pushing out of his back from within. At the same time, that scent grew stronger, and he found himself conflicted by its presence, almost arousing him as the pain became like razor blades splitting his back open. He stood, groaning, holding himself against the wall. A light overhead flickered on, and Rome fell back into the corner, startled by what he saw. In the middle of the room, suspended from the ceiling in a cocoon of white silk, was his brother, looking back at him in terror but unable to speak. Behind him stood the man with the sunglasses, smiling. The pain grew worse as Rome watched the spider legs emerge from behind the man, who was looking at Darius now, his mouth drooling. Blood fell to the floor as the man lunged his spider arms into Darius's back, pulling chunks of meat to his mouth. Rome fell forward onto the floor, writhing with the pain coming from his own back. There was a tearing sound, and he could feel the pain begin to dissipate with the pressure of things exiting his body. That sound, like snapping sticks, filled the room. The smell became so strong that he realized he was drooling like the man with the sunglasses. He brought himself to his feet, but his arms were limp. It was his other arms he was using now, almost instinctively, like they had been there the whole time, just waiting to sprout forward. He felt strong. Darius's eyelids grew weak with the life being drained from him. The scent of his blood beckoned Rome toward him. Rome sniffed once more. He hadn't eaten in so long. The man with the sunglasses continued to feast, oblivious to the mess he was making. Darius closed his eyes in submission, and death came quickly as the spindly appendages came lunging toward him. Far, far too many limbs to count.